Okay, great. Well, welcome, and want to thank you folks for having me. And what I thought I would do is just very briefly kind of give at least my sense of the summary of what the result of the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference was last week. And the first thing I would say is that you have to remember that the expectations going into it were unclear but somewhat pessimistic. So and that the 2005 conference had been a disaster. So I think it's fair to say that this conference, if it didn't fail, it deserved to be seen as a success, and it clearly didn't fail. So I think it was a success, but only an incremental success. It didn't really make major concrete agreements either on nuclear disarmament or on non-proliferation. It didn't concretely make progress, for example, on the Iranian case or the North Korean case, but I don't think it was expected to do that. So I think within the expectations, it was an incremental success and positive. Some of the reasons for that and some important developments are that the U.S. and the other nuclear weapon states clearly reaffirmed that they are committed to the elimination of their nuclear arsenals. There's not a timeline, and some people at the conference were urging that there be a timeline set for this. That was rejected. I think a timeline actually is unrealistic and would cause more problems than it would solve. It was rejected, but there was a clear reaffirmation that there is this obligation to nuclear disarmament. And that's important because that was agreed in 2000, but then between 2000 and this year, France had kind of led an effort of saying, well, actually, that's not a commitment, and they had doubts about it. The Bush administration said basically, well, that was the Clinton administration's commitment. It's not U.S. policy. So there was questioning and moving away from that commitment after 2000, and so now it's been reaffirmed by all of the nuclear weapon states, and I think that's very important. The document, the meeting, also reaffirmed that that this is a non-proliferation treaty, that non-proliferation is central. It's fair to say that there could have been, and many states wanted, more concrete statements, final commitments on non-proliferation, and those weren't agreed. They weren't blocked. There just wasn't time to really work through the disagreements on that. There are some specific elements. For example, Germany has proposed over the years, and Germany was supported this time, a clear policy on the issue of withdrawing from the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Article 10 of the treaty, and this is true of most treaties, has a provision where a state has the sovereign right to withdraw from the treaty. But it has never been really articulated, A, what the process of withdrawal would be, and B, what happens if a state is cheating on the treaty and then moves to withdraw from it to try to escape punishment for cheating. You say, okay, we broke it, but now we're out, so leave us alone. There's been an effort to try to clarify through the NPT that if you are non-compliant, if you break compliance with the treaty, you will continue to be held accountable for that, even if you seek to withdraw from the treaty. There was not a consensus on this, so there's a kind of a reference to it in the final document without a new consensus. And I think that's regrettable. It would take more time. This is also something where Iran is a party to the treaty, so it's in the meeting. And if the conference operates by consensus, which it has over the years, Iran could have blocked real concrete language on that. So that was one of the non-proliferation issues where, you could have welcomed a stronger language. There are others. The additional protocol, which is a tougher form of inspection that the IAEA has said should be the norm. It should be the international standard. Some countries, Brazil, Egypt, and other developing countries, blocked having the conference come out and declare this is now should be the universal standard. So there's language that says the additional protocol is desirable, states should join up to it, et cetera, but there's no clear articulation that this is required. The last two things I would say in general are that Egypt played an interesting constructive role in this conference. It was widely criticized in 2005 for kind of, in a sense, joining with the U.S., but for opposite reasons, to make a disaster of the 2005 conference. And that Egypt really did hold it up and obstruct any progress. And people were nervous about what would happen this time. And Egypt is now the head of the non-aligned movement this year, so it had extra power and responsibility, and by all accounts was very constructive in its leadership, and it paid off because Egypt had been pushing very hard for an agreement on the Middle East, to at least to hold an international conference to deal with the nuclear situation in the Middle East, and Egypt succeeded in that, which other states had wanted to. And actually, the U.S. worked very closely behind the scenes with Egypt and other Arab states in agreeing on this statement in the conference. Vice President Biden held a meeting in Washington with ambassadors from Arab states. The administration, including the White House, had been behind the scenes working with Egypt for a long time on this. And so that was a positive result. And then the last thing I would say is that you could see kind of in the shadows, and if you read behind the scenes, you could see Iran was pretty isolated at this conference. And I think that's a good thing. It's constructive for the world. It's arguably constructive for Iran. And so Iran didn't block an outcome. And I think at various times it backed down because it realized that it was isolated, including in the non-aligned movement. There were some moments where Iran objected to things or proposed things, and in other non-aligned states stood up and said, no, we have the opposite view. And that was very surprising, I think, to the Iranians, and so they kind of tempered a lot of their normal kind of behavior and rhetoric, feeling that they were actually isolated. So those would be my kind of major thoughts going forward, and then maybe we can just open it up.